The rain had started to fall just after 10 p.m. on the evening of October 12th, 2018, turning the narrow streets of Willow Creek into slick, winding paths. The small town, nestled deep in the woods of northern Michigan, was quiet at this hour, its residents mostly tucked away in their homes, oblivious to the darkness brewing within one family's walls. Emily Harris sat alone in her room, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. She was 16, a junior at the local high school, and still grappling with the sudden changes in her life. Just 6 months earlier, her mother Lisa had remarried, bringing a new man into their home. Greg Holloway was a successful contractor from a neighboring town, older by a decade, with a stern demeanor that set Emily on edge from the start. There was something about Greg that she couldn't place, something that didn't quite add up, especially when it came to her father's death 2 years earlier. Emily's father, Mark Harris, had been a quiet man, devoted to his family. His unexpected death in a car accident on a snowy night in February 2016 had shattered their lives. The police had concluded that Mark lost control of his car on the icy road, but Emily never fully accepted this explanation. Her father had been a careful driver, particularly in bad weather. The idea that he would make such a fatal mistake didn't sit right with her. Her suspicions grew stronger after Greg entered their lives. He had appeared out of nowhere, charming Lisa at a local charity event in April 2018. Within months, they were married, and Greg moved into the house where Mark's presence still lingered in every room. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Greg knew more about her father's death than he let on. On that rainy October night, Emily found herself revisiting those doubts. She had been digging into Greg's past, something she had started doing out of a nagging instinct that wouldn't leave her alone. Earlier that day, she had discovered that Greg had been working in their town around the time of her father's death, a detail her mother had never mentioned. This new piece of information only fueled her unease. Why hadn't her mother told her? Was there something Lisa was hiding, or was she simply unaware of the connection? As the clock ticked past midnight, Emily's thoughts turned darker. What if Greg had something to do with her father's death? It was a wild thought, one that would sound absurd to anyone else, but Emily couldn't let it go. The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing picture, one that hinted at a connection between Greg's sudden appearance in their lives and the tragedy that had torn them apart. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Lisa was asleep in the master bedroom down the hall, unaware of the storm brewing in her daughter's mind. Greg, too, was asleep, or so it seemed. Emily had noticed that he often stayed up late, making phone calls or sending messages from the privacy of his study. She had overheard snippets of conversation, vague mentions of business deals, and old acquaintances that only added to her suspicions. Just before 2 a.m., Emily made a decision. She couldn't ignore her instincts any longer. She needed to know more about Greg, about his past, and about what really happened on the night her father died. She knew she had to be careful. Greg was not the type of man to be easily fooled, but Emily was determined she would find out the truth no matter the cost. As she lay in bed, the rain continued to fall, its steady rhythm masking the tension that was building within the walls of the Harris household. Emily's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. There was no going back now. She was on a path that could lead to answers or to something far more dangerous. The stage was set for a confrontation that would unravel the secrets hidden in the shadows of Willow Creek. And as Emily drifted off to a restless sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought were closer than she realized, waiting to be uncovered no matter the cost. The real question was, could she handle the truth when it finally came to light? Emily Harris awoke on the morning of October 13th, 2018, with the uneasy feeling that had settled over her like a heavy fog. The events of the previous night still lingered in her mind, gnawing at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. As the sun broke through the clouds that had brought the storm, Emily knew she had to start digging deeper into Greg Holloway's past. The sense of dread that had gripped her when she first saw Greg's name in connection with her father's death had only grown stronger overnight. By 9 a.m., Emily was already at the local library, her backpack slung over her shoulder, and a determined look on her face. The library was quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil in her mind. She headed straight for the archives section, where old newspapers and public records were kept. hoping to find something that would either confirm her fears or put them to rest. Hours passed as she combed through the records, scanning headlines, reading articles, and piecing together a timeline. Then, buried deep in the back pages of a February 2016 issue of the Willow Creek Gazette, she found a brief mention of Greg Holloway. The article detailed a contract dispute between Greg's construction company and a local business. What caught Emily's eye, however, was the date, February 19th, 2016, the day before her father's accident. Greg had been in town the day before Mark's death, something neither her mother nor Greg had ever mentioned. Emily's heart raced as she copied down the details. What was Greg doing in Willow Creek that day? Was it really just business, or was there something more? She needed to know, and there was only one person who might have answers: her father's old friend, Tom Mitchell. By 1 p.m., Emily was standing outside Tom's modest house on the outskirts of town. Tom had been close to her father, working together on various projects over the years. After Mark's death, Tom had drifted away, unable to cope with the loss of his friend. But Emily knew that if anyone had insight into her father's last days, it would be Tom. As she explained her suspicions, Tom listened carefully, his brow furrowing deeper with each word. He confirmed that Greg's company had been involved in a project with her father's business shortly before the accident, but he didn't know much more. However, there was something in his expression, a hesitation, a flicker of doubt, that Emily couldn't ignore. It was as if Tom knew more than he was letting on, but for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to say it. Emily left Tom's house feeling more unsettled than before. It wasn't just that Greg had been in town, it was the way everyone seemed to skirt around the topic, as if there was an unspoken rule not to dig too deeply into the past. But Emily was determined to break that rule. She knew that the truth was buried somewhere in the shadows, and she was going to find it. Back at home, the atmosphere was tense. Lisa had noticed Emily's growing distance, but she had no idea what was driving it. By 7 p.m., the house was filled with the quiet sounds of dinner being prepared, but the silence between Emily and her mother was deafening. Greg was out, supposedly meeting with clients, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from them both. She knew that whatever she uncovered next could change everything, and that thought terrified her. Emily spent the rest of the evening in her room, the evidence she had gathered spread out before her like a puzzle. Each piece pointed toward Greg, but there were still gaps, missing details that she needed to fill in before she could confront him. She decided to search Greg's study, a place he kept meticulously organized and always locked when he wasn't around. But Emily had seen where he kept the spare key. Just after midnight, when the house was finally still, Emily crept down the hall. The only sound was the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. She carefully unlocked the study door and slipped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of her phone's flashlight. She quickly began searching through the drawers, scanning for anything that could provide answers. What she found made her blood run cold. Hidden at the bottom of a drawer beneath stacks of paperwork was a manila envelope labeled with her father's name. Inside were documents, letters, contracts, and a handwritten note in her father's unmistakable scrawl. As she read through the papers, her worst fears were confirmed. There had been a dispute between her father and Greg, one that had turned bitter in the days leading up to the accident. The evidence suggested that Greg had not only known her father, but had a direct, personal conflict with him. Emily's hands trembled as she put the papers back in the envelope. She had uncovered the connection she feared, but she was far from done. What she had found only deepened the mystery. She now knew that Greg had motive, but how far had he gone to protect his secret? As she quietly left the study, Emily realized that her investigation had reached a dangerous point. The truth was within reach, but so were the consequences, and in a house full of secrets, one wrong move could be deadly. The next morning, Emily Harris woke with a sense of urgency. It was October 14th, 2018, a Sunday, and the house was unusually quiet, the usual morning routines muted. Lisa had already left for her volunteer work at the local church, and Greg, as always, was off to an early meeting. This left Emily alone with the weight of what she had discovered the night before. The manila envelope she had found in Greg's study was now hidden beneath her mattress, the contents of which had kept her awake long into the night. By 8:30 a.m., Emily was pacing her room, trying to make sense of it all. The documents in the envelope were damning, a series of letters and contracts that revealed an escalating dispute between her father and Greg. The handwritten note from her father, dated February 18, 2016, hinted at a betrayal, accusing Greg of unethical business practices that Mark had been determined to expose. The next day, Mark had died in what the police ruled an accident, but Emily could no longer believe that narrative. The timing was too precise, the circumstances too suspicious. Emily knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She had to confront her mother, to force Lisa to see Greg for who he really was. But how? The evidence was compelling, yet confronting Greg directly seemed dangerous. Emily remembered Tom Mitchell's hesitation, the way he had held back when she mentioned her suspicions. Did he know more? Did he suspect something, but was too afraid to speak out? At 10 a.m., Emily decided to visit Tom again. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Tom's house was just a short walk from hers, but it felt like miles as Emily's mind raced with questions. When she arrived, Tom was in the garage, tinkering with his old truck. He looked up, surprised to see her, and Emily wasted no time showing him the documents she had found. Tom's face paled as he read the notes, his hands trembling slightly. Tom finally admitted that Mark had confided in him about the problems with Greg. There had been threats, veiled and otherwise, from Greg, warning Mark to back off or face the consequences. Mark had been determined to go public with the information, despite the risks. Then, just days before he could act, the accident happened. Tom had always harbored doubts about the accident, but without concrete evidence he had kept silent. Now, seeing the documents, those doubts transformed into a chilling certainty. By 12 p.m., Emily returned home, her resolve hardened. The truth was out there, and she needed to make her mother see it. But how could she do this without tipping off Greg? The man had been careful, covering his tracks well, but Emily knew that she was close to unraveling his carefully constructed facade. She decided to wait until the evening when Greg would be home, and she could confront them both together. She spent the afternoon going over the documents again and again, preparing herself for what was sure to be a volatile confrontation. The hours crawled by, each tick of the clock heightening the tension. At 6:30 p.m., Lisa returned home, her face brightening as she saw Emily in the kitchen. She seemed relieved that her daughter was making an effort to reconnect, completely unaware of the storm about to break. Emily waited until Greg came through the door at 7:15 p.m., his usual calm demeanor in place. Dinner was quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophe, with each passing moment laden with unspoken tension. At 8 p.m., Emily could wait no longer. She led her mother to the living room, the envelope clutched in her hand. Greg followed, sensing the change in the air, his eyes narrowing as he saw the seriousness in Emily's expression. Emily handed the envelope to Lisa, her heart pounding as her mother began to read. The silence stretched as Lisa's eyes scanned the papers, her face growing paler with each passing second. Greg's expression remained unreadable, a mask of indifference that only fueled Emily's anger. He knew what was coming, but he was prepared, confident that his secrets would stay buried. But as Lisa reached the handwritten note, her hands began to shake, tears welling in her eyes. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her husband's death had not been an accident. By 9 p.m., the confrontation was in full swing. Emily pressed her mother, forcing her to acknowledge the truth. Greg, however, remained disturbingly calm, denying everything with a calculated coolness that sent chills down Emily's spine. He accused Emily of fabricating evidence, of manipulating her grieving mother, but Emily stood her ground, her resolve stronger than ever. She knew what she had found, and she wasn't about to let Greg twist the truth. The tension in the room reached its peak when Emily demanded that they go to the police. Lisa, torn between her daughter's conviction and her husband's reassurances, hesitated. Greg's influence was strong, his manipulation subtle and effective, but Emily could see the cracks in his armor. She knew that if they didn't act now, the truth might never come to light. Then, just after 10 p.m., something shifted. Greg, realizing that he was losing control, made a fatal mistake. In his desperation, he revealed more than he intended, letting slip details that only someone involved in Mark's death would know. Emily pounced on this, her accusations turning sharper, more pointed. The mask Greg had worn so carefully began to crumble, and the man beneath was far more dangerous than she had imagined. As the night wore on, the confrontation took a darker turn. Lisa, now fully aware of the depth of Greg's deceit, began to see the truth for what it was. She had been blind, manipulated by a man who had taken everything from her. The realization shattered her, and for the first time she saw Greg for who he truly was, a predator who had preyed on her vulnerability. By midnight, the confrontation reached a breaking point. Greg, cornered and exposed, lashed out in a final, desperate attempt to regain control. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The events that followed would leave the family shattered, their lives forever changed by the dark secrets that had been unearthed. As the clock struck 12 a.m., Emily knew that the real battle was just beginning. The truth was now in the open, but what came next would be a test of strength, of survival. And as the night deepened, the final confrontation loomed on the horizon, ready to bring everything crashing down. The tension that had been simmering all evening finally erupted just after midnight on October 15th, 2018. The living room, once a place of comfort, had become a battlefield. The clock on the mantel ticked past 12:15 a.m., each second heightening the suffocating pressure in the air. The documents, now scattered across the coffee table, were no longer just pieces of paper. They were the keys to unlocking a dark truth that could no longer be contained. Emily's heart raced as she stood between her mother and Greg, who was pacing the room like a caged animal. The revelation that Greg had slipped, a minor detail about Mark's final moments, something only the person responsible for his death would know, had shattered the thin veneer of control he had maintained. Now, with his secrets exposed, Greg was no longer the calm, calculating man they knew. His facade had crumbled, revealing the danger that lurked beneath. Lisa, pale and trembling, clutched the edge of the couch as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. The disbelief in her eyes slowly gave way to a cold, hard realization. Her husband had not died by accident. He had been murdered, and the man she had welcomed into her life, into her home, was responsible. Greg's movements became more erratic, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the truth pressing down like a weight he could no longer bear. It was 12:30 a.m. when he finally stopped pacing, his gaze locking onto the door to his study. Emily noticed the shift immediately. A silent, desperate calculation was taking place in his mind. Her instincts screamed that he was about to make a final, dangerous move. In those tense moments, the house seemed to hold its breath. The rain from the previous night had left the world outside still and silent, as if nature itself was waiting for the inevitable. Emily's thoughts raced, her mind piecing together every interaction, every warning sign she had ignored. Greg had been playing a long game, and now, cornered, he was ready to strike. At 12:35 a.m., Greg lunged toward the study door, his intentions clear. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was after. The gun he kept hidden in the locked drawer of his desk, a weapon she had seen but never imagined he would use. The next few seconds stretched into an eternity. Emily's body moved before her mind could catch up, intercepting Greg before he could reach the study. The impact of her body against his was jarring, sending them both crashing to the floor. Lisa cried out, her voice breaking the silence that had hung so heavily over the house. The papers on the coffee table fluttered to the floor, forgotten in the chaos. Greg's face twisted into a snarl as he tried to wrestle free, his strength overpowering Emily's desperate hold. But she clung to him, refusing to let go, knowing that if he reached that gun, there would be no turning back. It was 12:40 a.m. when the struggle intensified. Greg managed to throw Emily off, sending her sprawling across the floor. He scrambled toward the study, but Lisa, driven by a mother's instinct to protect, blocked his path. The fear in her eyes had turned to fury, a primal need to defend her child from the monster she had unwittingly brought into their lives. Greg hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. He could see that the women in front of him were no longer the meek, confused figures he had manipulated for so long. They were fighting back, and the realization that he was outnumbered and outmatched sent a flicker of panic through him. At 12:45 a.m., Greg made one last attempt to push past Lisa, but Emily was already on her feet. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass vase, and swung it with all her might. The impact caught Greg off guard, sending him reeling backward, crashing into the wall. The vase shattered, the sound echoing through the house like the crack of thunder. Greg slumped to the floor, momentarily stunned. The room fell into a tense silence. The only sound the ragged breathing of the three figures locked in a standoff. Emily's hands shook, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She glanced at her mother, who was staring at Greg with a mixture of horror and relief. It was 12:50 a.m. when the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Greg, now dazed and bleeding from a gash on his head, made no further attempts to reach the study. He had been beaten, not just physically, but in the psychological game he had played for so long. The truth was out, and with it, the power he had held over them evaporated. Emily knew that the danger wasn't completely over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The man who had torn their lives apart was no longer in control. The secrets that had festered in the shadows of their home had been dragged into the light, and the next steps were clear. As the clock ticked toward 1 a.m., Emily looked at her mother and nodded. It was time to call the police. The final chapter of this nightmare was about to begin, and they would face it together. By the time the police arrived at 1:30 a.m. on October 15, 2018, the house on Willow Creek Road was a scene of quiet devastation. The living room, where the struggle had taken place, was now eerily silent. Greg Holloway, subdued and handcuffed, was led out by officers, his face a blank mask of defeat. The man who had so carefully orchestrated a life of lies and manipulation was finally exposed. Emily watched from the doorway, her hands still trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. The weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her, the reality of what they had uncovered sinking in. Her mother, Lisa, stood beside her, the shock of betrayal still etched in her features. She had loved and trusted Greg, only to discover that he was the man responsible for destroying their family. As the clock struck 2 a.m., the evidence was being gathered: Greg's letters, the contracts, and the damning note from Mark Harris. These pieces would form the foundation of a case that would reveal the full extent of Greg's crimes. The truth, long buried beneath layers of deception, was now undeniable. In the days that followed, the story of Mark Harris's death would unravel in courtrooms and headlines, a tale of greed, betrayal, and murder that shocked the small town of Willow Creek. But for Emily and her mother, the road to healing had only just begun. The darkness that had overshadowed their lives was finally lifting, but the scars would remain. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the house, Emily knew that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a chance to rebuild, free from the shadows of the past.